All right, everybody. Thank you for coming. I appreciate your patience. We're going to get started first. I'll just ask you to say hello in the chat. I see some familiar names. I would love to um, make this as interactive as possible, as much as I'll be able to follow the chat. My name is Dwight. Today we're talking all about privacy. It is a huge topic. It's difficult to do in 45 minutes. So I do want to challenge you to ask questions, to reach out to me, to figure out why this might be important to you. I guess that's today's biggest challenge. So we're discussing privacy's glow up. If you're familiar with cybersecurity or you've been in it for a while or even just started recently, you might notice that we don't talk about privacy very much. So that's today's session. I want to bring it to your attention, tell you why it's urgent, and try to get everyone interested and involved as possible. So I'm going to start my timer here. Um, and I will try to peek into the chat as I can, but let's get going. All right, first off, again, I'm Dwight. I'm a certified privacy professional. Full time, I work as a cybersecurity guy who has some privacy responsibilities. So I'm a compliance analyst at SimSpace. SimSpace is one of the large companies that does cyber ranges. So think about your hack the box and things like that. But imagine that for like military or for entire foreign governments. That's what we do at SimSpace, and I'm on the internal team that helps make sure that we're being safe with data, we're making sure things are confidential, and respecting people's both security and privacy. Both of them are really important for me. I've also recently been recognized as a privacy leader, as well as privacy hero semifinalist. So all that to say, privacy is what I do for work, but it is also something that is very important to me personally as well. Growing up in Atlanta with a family from Selma, people's dignity, people's rights has always been important to me. I'm one of those who kind of grew up on the shoulders of giants in terms of standing up for other people and speaking up and making sure uh, that they have those rights. So, and of course, mind your business is part of that. Making sure that we have this autonomy that includes both, not being disturbed, but also nowadays in the digital age, it needs to include having control of our data. Also, I've worked in nonprofits in the past, which included working in immigration, working with refugees, helping people get out of detention, and I've also been detained by some of the same authorities who I was trying to keep people um, from being stuck with. So I do know what it's like to have my rights taken away. I am paying attention to everything that's going on right now, and I think it's important to kind of keep these conversations going. So, with that said, again, the challenge today is really to ask, why might privacy be important to you? I think if you pay attention, you'll start seeing it more and more in the headlines, whether that's TV shows like Last Week Tonight, which is kind of informative and vulgar. If that's your if that's your niche, that might be a good show for you. But even just your regular news, we start to see privacy taking over the headlines, whether it's fines, whether it's just invasions of issues like facial recognition technology. You don't really have to go looking for privacy. It is something that's at our doorstep and something that we need to sort of be informed of. Right now, we have this big push to be AI literate, and I feel like we jumped right from kind of digital literacy to AI literacy, and privacy is one of these step you know steps middle steps along the way that we sort of need to go back and make sure that both we're informed personally, but also for our communities as well. So for today, I want to kind of start by looking at a little bit of the background. I don't want this to be like a full on history lesson. But I do think some context is important so you understand why privacy has just become more and more important. So I think it helps to have some contrast. So in particular, let's start with Europe. Europe privacy has been important for a long time. It predates even what I have on the screen here. So it predates the 70s. Um, a lot of what we see happening in the 70s were European laws about privacy, like national level laws about privacy. Where in the U.S. we're still just starting to get it as a legal concept, and that's because a lot of European history, but in particular some of the more recent history at the time, with just the threat of surveillance being like a real thing, what people experienced in Germany with the Nazi regime, that kind of was still fresh in people's mind, and so you do see a more willingness to legislate it, and you see that people kind of attach privacy as a like fundamental human rights, which is a bit of a contrast to what we see here in the US. Fast forward to the 90s, and we're seeing the internet become popular. At the same time, the EU is starting to put some protection laws in place, and we have some scattered laws like HIPAA, the law that protects your health data, starting to come into effect. But we never had this a national law, and we still don't have a national law that protects us in terms of privacy. We have these sort of what they call a patchwork of laws in the U.S. As you know, with surveillance, it kind of came to the forefront. So in contrast, we have cybersecurity blowing up in the 2000s. Because of these hacks and breaches and things, these important viruses that sort of came up that we saw. All of a sudden, everyone has to know what antivirus is. All of a sudden, everyone knows what a hacker is. And we saw these big national news were covering some of the fallout from the Patriot Act, where we saw both the government and some corporations teaming up to to surveil us, basically in a huge big data way, like scary bulk surveillance, not something that you would see in a movie, but actually came to real life during that time. And then and then so at that point, I would say privacy is still, it's something in the backdrop. It's still, again, it's like the sidekick to cybersecurity. This is definitely cybersecurity's boom, but um, privacy was not quite there yet. And then the 2010s, we see these huge scandals, WikiLeaks coming to light, uh, and so much to the point that it made Europeans, who again have this culture of privacy as a fundamental right, feel like they need data sovereignty, which is basically the idea that we don't trust the Americans and the other folks with our data. If we're going to send our data abroad, we need to have some protections on that data. And so that is a little bit of the context, or the historical context, of how we get to 2016. All right, I'm gonna pause there, peek into the chat, make sure you guys are okay. All right, I hope everybody's following me. I hope that wasn't too much history for you. But basically, that got us to GDPR, and GDPR is a monster of a law, and definitely the global standard in terms of privacy laws. It introduced a list of rights, like being able to have access to your data, being able to contact a company and find out what exactly they have on you, being able to make sure that information is accurate, requesting that information be erased, or maybe that it's rectified. These are all privacy rights that were extended to EU citizens by the GDPR. It is what we call an extraterritorial law, which means that even though the jurisdiction is the EU, of course, it extends beyond that jurisdiction to any company or private person handling the data of people in the EU, and that's kind of the first time we really see privacy go sort of full kind of global scale. And if you remember that time, I think, if you weren't really in the tech space, the way that we sort of know that period, it came out in 2016 and went into law 2018. But the way that we sort of remember that period is all of a sudden we had these pop-ups on websites that we were visiting. All of a sudden you know, had to click that, we had accepted the privacy notice or the privacy policy on a particular website. And so that is probably one of the hugest milestones in the history of privacy. The GDPR required data protection officers for companies handling EU data. And so even at privacy as a career changed with GDPR. So again, it was very much a function of maybe like the legal team putting things into contracts and making sure the data was protected, the ownership was protected. Now all of a sudden we see this role called a data protection officer, where it needs to have a little bit of independence from some of those legal duties. It needs to have a little bit of independence from maybe even some of the risk management duties, and has to report maybe directly to executives, maybe directly to the sort of board of directors, to have the power to bring up important issues about how data is being processed, determining like what is the legal basis for all of these really important nitty gritty topics that come along with the GDPR. And then, of course, what really got people's attention and still is getting people's attention today were the fines that were introduced. So we see millions, and we've even seen billion-dollar fines from the GDPR violations. And so that still, if you're trying to get your leadership to, you know, think about privacy in a more crucial way, one of the most effective things you can use is still fear. Money still moves people, and so being able to go in and talk about some of the fines that companies have gotten, both large companies and small companies, I think is still a good motivating factor. It shouldn't be the only thing that you discuss with your leadership, but it is very important to kind of escalate the conversation to that level. And again, GDPR set the tone for a lot of other privacy laws. So if you look at the CCPA today, the California Consumer Protection Act, and what was extended to the CPRA, as well as a lot of state privacy laws around the U.S. at the moment, there are some that passed even just this year, and more sort of coming out as a solution to not having this sort of national level law. You will find that a lot of them continue or extend these same rights or similar sort of rights to what we see with the GDPR, where you have an opportunity to access the information that these companies have on you. You have an opportunity to make sure it's correct and used and consensual, like you actually approve these companies to have your data. All right, apologies. I know GDPR is a lot, and we just kind of skimmed the surface with that. But the big thing is privacy went from just something in contracts, just on legal teams, to all of a sudden this is in your face for a lot of different areas of companies. So privacy is no longer the sidekick. It is the main act. That's definitely the case today. We see it getting more and more important for people familiar with cybersecurity. You know that sort of the focus, sort of foundation is that what they call the CIA, the confidentiality, integrity, availability. Privacy is a little bit different. It has some other principles that it upholds. It isn't it isn't only just making sure that we only have certain data, but it also applies to fairness. Like, yeah, is that data being used ethically, which is something we may not consider it in cybersecurity? Are we being transparent about what we're doing with people's data, with people's information? And then minimization is almost, is one of the ones that I think is really distinct from cybersecurity, where we're saying, do we really need all this data? Which is a definite pushback against maybe your marketing team, maybe some of the teams that you work with that are trying to collect as much data as possible. You have the responsibility, even though it's not fun sometimes, as the privacy person, maybe as just a privacy champion, to come in and ask some questions about, like, hey, do we actually need all this data? Do we have the rights to all of this data? Are we using it? Are we using it ethically? Is it fit to the purpose of what we're doing? And do we have legal basis for processing it? So cybersecurity protects the data, but privacy decides if you should even have it at all. So it went from this sidekick sort of issue to now we see these big laws, these privacy laws, where you see these, or maybe from getting a piece of mail where some data breach expose your data. Now you have to put a freeze on your credit or something like that. We see that a lot of what is driving cybersecurity in some ways are those sort of regulatory issues related to privacy, where especially you see in a lot of these privacy laws, they do have a security aspect. We look at HIPAA; it has a security portion to it, where you need to have a certain cybersecurity, uh, cyber hygiene for companies handling health data. And other laws, your state privacy laws, are definitely similar. All right, all right. Taking a breather, checking in on y'all. All right, feel free to drop any questions you have so far in the chat. I'm moving right along. I think I might even be a little bit ahead of schedule. Hopefully, that will leave us with some Q&A at the end. Gabrielle, I definitely see your message, and yes, it is definitely an issue where whoever has the data can use it as they want until we put some protections in place. So um, privacy, especially privacy for children, is a is almost an entire niche into itself. They have laws like um, specific laws for how you even design and collect consent from children, and typically it has to do with a guardian and who is of age to give consent, and it might vary from state to state. So typically, people who specialize in in privacy might have a even further specialization to talk specifically about children's privacy. And so, if that's something you're interested in, I would encourage you to reach out to folks on LinkedIn that we see posting about this, because it is a very important space. All right, again, this is something that, of course, it's important to you personally, but I think professionally, it's important that we understand, even if you're not in a privacy role, that it's still important. It's You still might have some function, to consider privacy, whether that's as an executive in building trust, whether that's on the design phase, product UX engineering, where you have to consider privacy from the get-go in design, in development, and some of those early meetings to figure out how you're gonna protect people's data. Maybe that's as a member of, the marketing team, the compliance team, other teams where it may not be the priority, but it is something that we can no longer ignore in these other roles. So we have to make it a part of how we build, how we design, how we lead. Also, it is pretty crucial for AI governance as well as we see these technologies sort of speeding ahead, faster than most of us can keep up, getting more and more powerful in what it can do. We really need something like privacy to come in and sort of set the boundaries to say, hey, no, this is unethical. This is a violation of people's rights. Like this is important to sort of put up the guardrails on what these AI features and services can do. In our enthusiasm for AI, it's important to also have not to just jump into what they call automation bias, where we're so enthusiastic we just start to lean towards whatever the AI systems may be telling us as the truth, right? But we also have to kind of take a step back and make sure that, hey, we're not just jumping in the van in the AI wagon without any concerns for our safety and our rights, and for not only the our own dignity, but the dignity of others. So we need to make sure we're considering the harms, making sure that AI doesn't amplify those harms. AI is only as good as the data that it learns from. So if it's looking at historically biased data, you're going to get biased results. And we want, especially if you're in AI governance or trying to be in AI governance, we want these applications, these systems that we're building to increase trust, not use the data that we have in an unfair way that kind of degrades that trust and leads to other problems, mistrust, and reputational reputational distrust as well. Privacy is also a social justice issue. So going from AI governance to, like, when you start to dig into some of these issues, especially in the Black community, we don't always have a maybe one good place to sort of point to some of this stuff, but we do see across a variety of different fields, we see where algorithmic bias is starting to impact our community specifically. So when we look at policing, we talk about predictive policing. You find all sorts of news articles, all sorts of YouTube documentaries that sort of focus on the way predictive policing has been used, even in the way that it has been used uh, to kind of profile juveniles, kids while they're still in school, getting in trouble in school, and all of a sudden the police are knocking on their door. If you haven't heard of Pasco County, Florida, I would encourage you to give that a search and see how detrimental predictive policing was in that particular community, where police were encouraged to harass people on a daily basis, based not on solely on laws that they committed, but also on what they were predicted to do, based on faulty data. We also see facial recognition technology misidentifying people of color, being particularly bad at recognizing Black faces. So, and also the faces of women and other minorities as well. But that, of course, leads to wrongful arrest. I think Detroit is a hot spot for that. Some of the first wrongful arrests because of facial recognition were in that city, but it has happened in other places. People being pulled over, arrested, and maybe on the other side of the country for things that happen that they have no idea about, but because they look like someone, or came up in a match, they've been detained and harassed. We see this with hiring. There's a case going on right now with Workday. If anybody's applied to a job with Workday, it's one of those where sometimes you can get a denial before, just as soon as you click send. And so there's a case right now arguing that that's because of bias, age bias, racial bias, and other types of discrimination with that algorithm, that a lot of applications never went to a person, but they went to some autonomous system that we don't have any sort of transparency into. We don't have any sort of redress or a way to ask for a person to look at it, or inquire about why these denials are happening at such a high rate. And then we also see, like, when you get online to do a interview, there may be some AI data analysis of those sort of video interviews that impact, that look at the way that we speak or the way that we look in ways that might be unfair. This extends to housing, housing denials, both in terms of renting all the way up to who gets a mortgage and who doesn't get a mortgage. And then, of course, health data. It's particularly upsetting to see people denied health, access to health, further resources, because they, you know, um, were a misfit with the data. They appeared healthy according to the data, maybe because Black people spend less. This is the case with one of the healthcare algorithms, where they evaluated who might need increasing healthcare based on what they spent, and of course, it misidentified a lot of people and missed an opportunity to really extend healthcare to a lot of people who really needed it, and a lot of it was racial discrimination. And so these are some of the issues. There are social justice issues. There are, beyond what we need to do for work, beyond what we need to do personally, but there are things that we need to consider, both for privacy, and then as well as AI gets more and more important, that we kind of keep tabs on. All right, that was a lot. That was, really going through the history of privacy, talking about why it's important for you in a couple different facets. I also want to provide some resources. If you are interested in privacy as a career, you definitely want to check out the IAPP. This is the International Association of Privacy Professionals. They have conferences, they have certifications, they have webinars, and all sorts of things. It is something that you want to check out, and maybe find some folks on LinkedIn that are active in the communities, so you can kind of get a sense for what's happening. What are some of those discussions? What are some of the subfields of privacy, like discussed in the chat? We talked about children's privacy. There are other subfields, like just cookies and consent. Maybe you're more on the technical side. Maybe you are interested in being a privacy engineer and helping making sure the data that's collected on websites is ethically done, and helps prevent your company from ending up in litigation about wiretap laws, which are being used to kind of crack down on companies whose cookies are on your website, and then are on the website, and they're tracking you even beyond when you leave that website, when you're looking at other things online. So excuse me, this is the definitely one of the best resources. They put out tons of reports, tons of news articles that you can have a look at and browse, and get a better idea of what privacy as a profession is like. Another group is ForHumanity. I'll try to throw some of these links in the chat in a moment, but ForHumanity is a auditing organization. They come up with auditing schemes for autonomous systems, both autonomous as well as AI, and everything similar to that. They do have free training and low cost certification, so it's always one that I recommend. But I also like it because they will have all sorts of activities that you might want to join in on, creating resources for AI literacy, and you can take that and adapt that for your community or context specifically. So it's a good place to learn. It's a good place to get hands on with a lot of these projects, and then even use some of the activities that you do with the group on your resume, on your LinkedIn, and continue to sort of important discussions about this stuff. And then this is one that's a personal project. This is a public Trello board that I created to sort of track some of the algorithmic bias that impacts the Black community in particular. It's called AI Harms Us. It's a link to um, some work that I did in a course, looking at some of the profiling that happened in healthcare, in policing, in housing, and starting to look at how specifically you might have a AI harms database, but it doesn't really zero in on what is happening in our community. And so I think it's difficult to really have the urgency that we need to have for addressing some of these issues, because maybe we don't see what all is happening in one place. We might see singular headlines here and there, but this gives, I'm hoping to encourage people to look at some of this software, some of this scary software, look at some of the resources, like the Atlas of Surveillance is one of the things linked in there, that kind of tells you what your local policing units are using for surveillance, and then looking at some of the articles that are related to that, how that is showing up in our communities, how that's deciding who's hired, who's detained, and even maybe how it's being abused in issues that are, not necessarily always specific to our community, but maybe a corollary to our community, like what we see happening in the immigration space. And so we talked about facial recognition technology, but this extends to other issues as well, like um, using AI to triangulate the sound of gunshots. Like there's all sorts of different technology out there, license plate readers, things that might be happening right in your community, or maybe something that you've noticed, like, what are these extra cameras for? Well, they might say that your license plate is not private information, but if it's linked to you, if it identifies you, if it all of a sudden they collect it everywhere you go, even if it's just mundane data, if they know you go to this particular store every Wednesday, that is something that we need to be concerned about and open and outspoken about. So, all right, I want to say thank you to everybody for listening. I know this is a big topic, some heavy pieces to it, some really legal aspects to it, some really historical stuff to it, some really upsetting things to it when we see the weight of what's happening in our community. Sometimes I look at this stuff, I'm like, I feel like a investigative journalist trying to put all these stories together, and there's a lot. There's so much I didn't get a chance to mention today. So I want to say thank you for listening. Please be connected, and I'm going to hang out for a few moments for some Q&A, and just to see if we got any questions sort of coming up in the chat. First off, let me get the AI harms link up for y'all. So I'm going to drop that into the chat if anybody wants to check it out. There are some other, I mentioned IAPP, I mentioned uh, ForHumanity. There are some other important groups looking at this stuff in more detail than what I did. So there's a group called the Algorithmic Justice League. that exists to kind of bring this stuff to light. There's um, what is it? EFF, I believe, one of the important organizations pushing back about our rights. They may not always be specific to what's happening in the Black community, but they're important places to know what's happening in general. And yeah, I would definitely challenge you guys to go in and check some of that out. Check the important work out to be active in those sort of civil society efforts to look at your AI tools and the information that's available about them. Are they transparent? Are they talking about what they're doing? Do they have the AI model card that kind of tells you sort of what's going on? Do they have a way for you to get feedback and be a part of the process? You know, if your chatbot tells you something random, tells you something crazy, do you have a way to sort of push back and tell people more about that? I see you guys, all everybody's encouragement in the chat. Thank you so much. Yeah, I appreciate that. I'm going to let me see if I can also drop the Atlas of Surveillance. This is the one I mentioned about finding out what type of surveillance is happening specific to your community, and it is a project of EFF, the Electronic Frontier Foundation. They have a lot of stuff happening. They're even the ones that do what is it, Privacy Badger. I think it's like a one of these things that you can pop right into. Um, yeah, thank you for catching that, Peter. The link is wrong, but if you guys hit my profile on here, you should be able to pull up my LinkedIn. I'll drop that link in as well. This is stuff that I appreciate being able to discuss with everyone. It's nerdy, heavy stuff, and it takes a definitely takes a community to sort of address. All right, again, a big thank you to BitCon for hosting me. I really appreciated being able to bring some of these issues, being able to speak up about privacy and why it's getting more and more important. I hope it inspires you and encourages you to take a look at some of these things a little bit more closely, and that we can stay connected. So, everybody, enjoy the rest of the talks and have a great day. I appreciate the chance to speak to you today.